Good morning, everybody. This is Andrew Plato with ANITIAN. I want to welcome all of you to Rapid Risk Assessment, a new approach to risk. Our Thursday morning webinar, we're going to discuss a new approach to risk assessment. I want to thank everybody for attending today. I hope you can all hear me okay. We will be taking questions at the end. If you have any questions, please use the question feature or the chat feature of this webinar. And you can ask them throughout the presentation if anything comes up and you want to know any more information. Just go ahead and chat them to me and we will answer them at the end. We are also recording this presentation, so a recording will be available at the end. And of course, you can always get the slides from our SlideShare website, or you can always email info@anitian.com and we'd be happy to send them to you. Again, I want to thank everybody for coming today. I really appreciate all of you taking some time out of your busy schedules to meet with us to talk about risk assessment today. This is somewhat of an encore presentation. We did this presentation at Secure 360 in Minneapolis just a few weeks ago, and the room was absolutely filled. They actually had to kick people out. And so we wanted to make sure that those people who did not get to attend that meeting, as well as a bunch of other people who are interested in risk assessment, would get a chance to hear about our rapid risk assessment approach and some of the problems with risk assessment. So let's take a second here and talk about what we're going to talk about here today. So I want to start off by kind of declaring our intention, what we intend to do today. So the first part of this presentation, I want to talk to you about what's kind of wrong with risk assessment these days. And this is born out of our own experience at ANITIAN and some research we've been doing over the past few years. So we're going to take about 20 minutes or so. I'm going to talk about what we call really the failure of current risk management techniques. Then we're going to, on the latter part of this presentation, I'm going to introduce you to rapid risk assessment, a new approach to risk assessment, a new way to do risk assessment in a faster and more efficient way to get the intelligence that you need to better manage risk in your environment. So there's just a kind of a quick outline of the presentation. Let me also take a second and introduce myself, although I see some names on the list here. Many of you know who I am. If you don't know who I am, I'm the president and the CEO of ANITIAN. I've been in the information security industry now for about 20 years. I have a background in developing security technologies. I was very integral in developing some of the first intrusion prevention technologies. I've been doing security-related work for a long time. And of course, I've been involved in helping develop this risk assessment approach here at ANITIAN. I think the thing I always like to remind people about myself and really about ANITIAN in general is that we are very much pragmatists when it comes to information security. We believe that good security is an empowering force in your organization when it is done rationally and pragmatically. Which really gets to my next slide, which is to introduce you to ANITIAN. ANITIAN is a 18-year-old information security consultancy. At ANITIAN, we really believe that information security can make the world a better place. It is our belief that in order to have innovation and growth, you need good security. The history of civilization is a history of security being a prerequisite for any form of growth, enlightenment, or innovation. As such, we believe that the key to this is to enlighten and create better security leaders. And we do that through a variety of security-related services. We do, of course, risk assessment services. We're also a PCI auditor. We do penetration testing. Anything related to helping organizations overcome the numerous hurdles of not only understanding information security, but tackling it and making it that empowering force throughout the organization. I would also mention many of you know of us as a product reseller. That is a part of our business that, if you haven't heard, is a dwindling side of our business. We've actually started to move more towards services and less on the product side. We find this is allowing us to be a lot more independent in our assessment services. Okay, so let's jump into this conversation, and let's start with kind of making sure we have a groundwork, a foundation here where all of us sort of understand what we're talking about. So I want to talk quickly here about kind of the risk environment. And we'll start with a slide which probably a lot of you, I mean, you already know all this. I'm probably going to say a lot of things that many of you are already familiar with, but really let's make sure we all understand what is risk assessment. What is the whole point behind it? When you get right down to it, risk assessments are really to answer very simple questions about your organization, which is what could harm the company or your organization? How bad could that harm be? And how do we stop that? So that's the core of what risk assessment's all about, answering those high-level sort of questions that, frankly, any good security person is already asking. So when you kind of pick that apart, what we're really trying to do in any risk assessment is identify what threats are relevant to the business, analyze those threats and determine what's the risk of those threats actually happening, craft some sort of reasonable remedy or mitigation strategy to either fix or transfer or accept the risk. But ultimately, if you kind of think about what risk assessment's really about, it's all about trying to get leadership to understand what the risk to the organization is so that they can make sensible and reasonable risk decisions. Risk assessment is fundamentally a decision-making tool. It is intended to empower leadership, management, and security teams to understand what threats are really relevant to the organization and what they need to be doing. So you can think of it as really the beginning of any good information security program. Now, when we look at the industry, there is an increasing emphasis on risk assessment. Just in the last few years, you have seen multiple regulatory bodies, the industry as a whole, really start to kind of glom on to risk assessment. First off, risk assessment has always been a requirement if you're PCI compliant. So 12.1.2 says you have to conduct an annual risk assessment. The HIPAA omnibus regulations reinforced not only the need for risk assessment, but clarified it and has really increased the prevalence and the importance of it. So there's specific requirements for conducting the annual risk assessment, which is a HIPAA requirement, but also they added language that if there's any suspected breach in the organization, there's an expectation that the information security teams will conduct a fair and honest risk assessment. The FFIEC, which is the financial regulation body, issued a supplement in 2011 to also emphasize the need for financial organizations to be doing annual risk assessments. There's also just, if you look at what's been going on in the industry lately, given some of the high-profile breaches that have happened, a lot of people are saying to themselves, why aren't these technologies protecting us? Why are we having these breaches? And so risk assessment has risen to the top as, rather than run out and buy a bunch of gear, let's understand what the threats to our business are. The long and short of it is there's really increased scrutiny on information security teams. If you look at this quote from the HIPAA omnibus regulation, they make it very clear that their expectation is risk assessment is not just some exercise you just do, but they expect them to be, what they say here, right? Thorough, completed, in good faith, and for the conclusions to be reached to be reasonable. That's great language because it makes it very clear. Risk assessment is no longer just some sort of thing you do, but it needs to be an integral and important part of your information security program. So what it really comes down to is that regulations are demanding more risk assessments. The regulators are shifting to look at risk assessments, particularly if you look at the financial industry. There's a lot of focus on organizations conducting risk assessments. You're also hearing business leaders say, look, I need to know where the problems are. I need to know what the issues are. So what is the problem? Why do we have this disconnect between this need to do risk assessment and the reality of risk assessment? Well, that gets us really to our next section, which is the failure of current risk assessment processes. And this all begins really with a story. So a few years back, about 5 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, ANITIAN completed a risk assessment for a pretty large financial organization. They had hired us to conduct their annual risk assessment. We came in and We conducted a very traditional, formal risk assessment. We used OCTAVE as our primary methodology. We completed worksheets. We wrote we sent out questionnaires. I mean, we really followed the risk assessment methodologies to a T. I mean, we did everything that all the methodologies said. And at the end of the effort, and this took months to complete, I might add. At the end of the effort, we were sitting down with the CIO of this organization, and we're all sitting around a big conference table there. And we, of course, had printed out the report we had written, this big 300-page tome of we all thought we were really brilliant for this, great piece of work we had produced. We're all sitting around a table talking, and the CIO of this organization picks up our report, and he kind of shakes it at us, which was a little difficult to do because it was pretty heavy. And he says, "What am I supposed to do with this? What is this?" And he kind of throws it down on the table, and it makes this, real dense, whomp on the table. He's like, "What am I supposed to do with this? What's the problem here? I don't, there's pages and stuff." And he's like, "I need to know what I need to do here." Well, needless to say, we were sort of like, we're sitting there dancing around like, trying to defend ourselves. The honest truth is he was right. When we walked out of that meeting, myself and some of the other consultants in the organization, we kind of had a navel-gazing moment there, and we're saying to ourselves, he's right. This isn't very useful. Even though we did everything, we followed everything. We were very diligent in conducting a very honest, risk assessment. The ultimate end product was not very useful. And that really caused us to sort of reflect and start analyzing the whole risk assessment market or business, as it would be. And I started talking to other leaders out there. I have the fortune to be part of a CEO group where I get to meet with other business leaders on a pretty regular basis. And I get to go to some of these national conventions and stuff. And I talk to CEOs of large and small and all different kinds of companies. And we also, as in our consulting practice, we're always talking to IT security leaders. We kept hearing really a lot of these quotes that you see on the page here. Why is this taking so long? What does all this mean? What's the problem? What is all this charts and worksheets? And this is just, one thing I hear a lot from CEOs, this is just all meaningless regulatory nonsense. It's just stupid paperwork exercises. And that really is what started the process of us saying, there's something very broken here. Risk assessment at its most basic level is broken. We were not the only ones saying this either. When we started doing some research, we noticed a lot of other people were saying very similar things. This is an article. This is from a couple of years back. Richard Steinen wrote this article. It's a really good article. I put the link down there. If you all get a chance, go read it, because Richard makes some great points in this article. One of the key points he makes in this article is that it's nearly impossible to value IT assets. And he talks about some other challenges and problems of risk management. And there's a lot of other articles very similar to what Richard has written, as well as some other authors. But he talks about the challenges of managing risk in an IT environment, specifically this challenge around how do you really value things? I mean, what's the value of an individual email? What's the value of an individual piece of data or a database? I mean, you can literally have two systems sitting in a network, and one of them is virtually worthless, and sitting right next to it on the same network is a completely priceless piece of equipment, because the data it holds is essentially the entire company. And so it gets really, really complicated to pin value on any one specific asset. Not to mention the fact the value of those assets changes on probably an hourly or minute basis. There's incredible volatility in this, and therefore even trying to value them becomes somewhat of a fruitless sort of goose chase. Here's another. This is a book. Doug Hubbard wrote this book. I don't necessarily like everything in this book. It's a little long-winded, and he kind of goes off on some pretty esoteric concepts. But this book does make some very good points, and really what I got out of this book, and again, I'd encourage all of you to read it, is that, you know, these risk assessment approaches that we're using, they're not working because they're not actually responding to risk. We're not actually fixing things. And you don't need to go any further than the information security news that comes out on pretty much a daily basis. You know, breach, 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 breach. Whatever risk assessment approaches and risk management tactics these organizations are using, they are not working because they are not delivering true risk reduction to the organization. So when we start to kind of pull back from all this and we say to ourselves, well, what's the issue here? We kind of came down to these four sort of conclusions. Risk assessment approaches are too slow. The current methodologies that are out there, NIST, OCTAVE, all the various ones, they're just simply too slow. Executive leadership doesn't get it. They don't understand what's inside them. They're not reading the reports. They're not providing clear, actionable steps to reduce risk and actually provide the necessary protections for the organization. And ultimately, our risk assessment approaches are failing to protect the business. So we kind of started with that hypothesis, and then we picked apart the process, and we said, now what are the components of risk assessment that are really problematic? And we found about 5 of them, and I want to step through those pretty quickly. And the first one is probably the biggest of them all, which is fail number 1, the language of risk assessment. Now, I'm an English major, if most of you don't know that. I'm one of the few English majors who actually has a job. There's about 5 of us. We get together on a yearly basis, and we all thank ourselves for actually having work. Anyways, so I have a passion for language, and I'm a person who always has found a lot of interest in how people phrase things, and my whole sort of college career was learning how to become a better writer and learning how to do things like end positioning and using adjectives and all this sort of fun language stuff. But one of the things about language that you learn when you are a writer and a communicator is that language not only affects comprehension, but it also affects acceptance. The scientific community is absolutely stymied by this problem in today's world. If you look at how the scientific community is sort of trying to engage the population, the problem they have is how do you take these incredibly complicated, intricate, and nuanced scientific concepts and communicate them to people who, frankly, don't understand the language of science. And because they don't understand the language of science, they don't accept it. And so they reject some of these scientific findings, which I'm not going to necessarily highlight the ones, but I think some of you can figure out what I'm talking about. They reject these scientific findings because they don't understand the language of science. Risk assessment has the same problem. Management doesn't understand the language. They don't get it. They don't, I put a definition up here. This is from OCTAVE for defined evaluation activities. I mean, I'll be honest with you. I've read this paragraph 3 or 4 times. I don't even think I understand it. And if I don't understand it, I can guarantee you your executive leadership isn't going to understand it either. And that becomes really one of the hinge problems in risk assessment today. The language, the reporting, the structures we're using are fundamentally incomprehensible to the people who are making decisions. And because they're incomprehensible, they do not accept the conclusions that come out of those. They just reject them and say, well, this is just meaningless paperwork. And quite frankly, they're right. When you look at what a lot of risk assessments are, they are meaningless, nitpicking paperwork exercises. They do not actually identify the key problems in the organization. They just sort of check off a bunch of boxes, which is exactly the problem we found when we did our very traditional risk assessment for that company I mentioned, is that while we did everything correctly, it was not communicating the essence of the organization's challenges to executive leadership. So language is problem number 1, and it is probably the number 1 problem that risk assessment has today. The next big problem is what we call the fallacy of numbers. There's this mentality among a lot of security people, and frankly it's among a lot of IT people in general, that if you produce a lot of charts and graphs, and they have numbers and values and you know, decimal points and calculations and big sort of trigonometric calculus on this, that somehow it's all more empirical and real. And nothing could be farther from the truth. And here's the problem. Anytime you have a calculation where one of the numbers in that calculation, one of the variables in that calculation is nothing more than a guess or an estimate, you know, well, I think this is about that's about a 4. Well, then the whole calculation has become subjective. You cannot force empiricism out of what is essentially a subjective exercise. It's impossible. It just can't happen. You cannot make it more empirical or more, you know, rigid. It just is. And the other problem is that these numbers create this kind of misleading sense of accuracy. This idea of, well, you know, well, we're a 61, and so, you know, this is a very accurate statement of what we are. Well, what the heck does that number mean? You know, what is a 61, you know, versus 161 or 361? That's kind of the next problem, is that these create like a false scale that doesn't really translate into the real world. These numbers, if you're not kind of immersed in the constant, you know, language of risk assessment and risk management, then you're not going to necessarily know what those numbers are meaning. Even if you throw them up on a heat map or some sort of graph, it doesn't really have a lot of tangibility to them. So you can't apply, as we like to say, you can't apply financial risk models to something that is highly volatile, like information systems. It just doesn't kind of work. The process of evaluating risk in an information security realm is, at some level, a subjective exercise. It is an assessment. It is an opinion statement. We'll talk about that a little more as we move on. The next big problem we identified is that these are just simply too time-consuming. IT risk in today's world is incredibly volatile. And simple sort of thought exercise. Think back to about a year ago or 6 months ago, the threats that you considered important to your organization. Now think about the threats that you think are important today. My guess is that's probably changed a bit. And if you go back even a couple of years, it's changed a lot. Risk assessments cannot take a year to complete because within 90 days, the environment has kind of gone stale. Any of your data has gone stale. And if you look at risk assessment methodologies, particularly NIST and FAIR and OCTAVE, they're simply too time-consuming. They take too much time for people to complete because there's too much paperwork in them. One of the common tactics that a lot of organizations use to do their risk assessments is they issue surveys and questionnaires to people to get them to fill them out. I'm going to talk about surveys and questionnaires more than a few times, but let me just tell you all very honestly up front, surveys and questionnaires are a gigantic waste of time. They simply do not work. And I'm going to mention my reasons for that in another few slides here. The next point I'd like to make on this is that risk assessments are not a consensus of opinions. It is not something where we all come together and kind of kumbaya ourselves and sort of feel our way to, oh, well, how do we feel about the risk in our organization? It's not the way it works. It is not, let's get everybody's opinion and try to, bubble up one master opinion out of those. It is an assessment. It is a single person or group of people coming in and saying, this is the threat and this is the risk. There has to be definitiveness to it. And without that, it devolves into arguments and debates and people who, the problem we have in today's IT world is that it's easier to argue and debate and to try to muddy the process than it is to accept reality, and the reality being that there are risks throughout the organization. So you can't be kind of pursuing everybody's opinion in this. Quite frankly, everybody's opinion is just going to devolve the process. Next big problem we have is what we call the probability problem. And I threw a quote up here from one of my favorite movies, Fight Club. It's a great line. It's on a long enough timeline, the survivability rate for everybody drops to 0. That is a line that, frankly, anybody involved in risk assessment, you should put it on your wall because it should define exactly one of the core problems of risk assessment as a whole, which is that on a long enough time frame, anything can happen. Universes can form on a long enough time frame. You can evolve dinosaurs into birds. I mean, time frame is critical to probability. But if you, again, look at most risk assessment approaches, they don't even consider time frame. The other problem we have here is what we call the fallacy of backtesting. This inability of people to properly put risk in context with their own perceptions. People think, well, we weren't hacked last year, so we're not going to get hacked this year. No, that's not how it works. That's sort of the lottery fallacy, right? People say, oh, well, you know, I didn't win last week with these numbers, so I don't want to play them this week. Actually, your chances haven't changed at all week from week. You could play 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 every week, and you have the exact same odds that you'd have if you just played random numbers. Humans are fundamentally bad at assessing the probability of things because our emotions get in the way. Our perceptions get in the way. There's a great article, you can read it from Bruce Shire about the psychology of security. He actually wrote it about 10 years ago, but he talks specifically about the inability of us as human beings to really understand probability. We tend to over-exaggerate sensational threats like hacking cars and hacking medical device implants and other kind of ludicrous stuff, and we undervalue things that are much more likely to happen. Things like, you know, doofus spilling Mountain Dew down the front of a server, which is my favorite threat that affects organizations. We also have the problem that a lot of breach statistics, right? So every year there's like 5 or 6 companies, they go, this is the annual breach statistic report from, important, our studies prove that 96.3% of all organizations have experienced a breach. Well, you have to remember that those statistics come from the data that company has. And the data that company has is really only from their own customers. And not to mention the fact that the companies who tend to put those breach statistics out, guess what they sell? Yeah, they sell you services that can actually help. So you got to kind of keep in mind what's the source of that reporting, number one. But number two, the other and more important thing to remember is that the majority, I mean like 90-some% of organizations never report their breaches. So statistics are fundamentally flawed because we don't really have a good sample of data. And we don't even always know the sample of data. That much being said, we know breaches happen a lot because they're out there and we see them ourselves. So we know they're prevalent. But the statistics that exist are somewhat flawed, so we can't always rely on those. Our last big problem is really what we call the lack of evidence. A lot of the risk assessment methodologies that are out there are focused heavily on process and documentation and too little on actual hard evidence of what's going on in the environment. And this is where I'm going to take my time and I'm going to talk again about questionnaires. You heard me say just a few slides ago, questionnaires are useless. They are. And here's the reason. Do you honestly think that somebody that you hand a questionnaire to about their job is going to write on that questionnaire, oh yeah, I'm completely incompetent. I really don't know what I'm doing. I'm actually drunk right now, and I haven't patched my systems in the last 6 months. I'm leaving right now to go and try and find another job. Of course not. Nobody is ever going to tell you that on a questionnaire because they'd lose their jobs, right? People, quite frankly, are not honest. They're not going to be honest on these reports and questionnaires. They're never going to tell you what's really going on because if they told you what's really going on, they'd be fearful for their jobs. And therein lies what is the key problem with almost all risk assessments. You can't trust people to tell you the truth all the time. They're always going to slightly skew whatever you hear from them for their own benefit, which is why risk assessments must have technical testing as an integral component to the entire process. Without that, how do you trust what people are saying? How do you know? You can't trust that the database admin or the development team or the network admins are going to actually tell you that, on some survey that they're really doing their jobs. More importantly, I can tell you that a lot of leadership, they don't trust these things. They see these reports and these questionnaires and stuff. They don't believe they're true. They know people lie. They know that people aren't going to tell you the truth. So this lack of evidence erodes trust in the entire process. Without hard evidence that can be corroborated with what people say, you don't really have any sort of true assessment going on. And we can do this. It's actually not that difficult to do. If I sit down and talk to a database admin and he's, oh yeah, I patch my systems, we're on top of everything, we encrypt everything, we're really doing a great job here. Well, we can run a vulnerability scan or do a pen test of that system, and I can validate what he's saying is true. If he tells me he's doing a good job and then I see he hasn't patched that system, since 2004, I know he's lying to me. And now I know that I've got a threat right there. Not only do I have a system with a lot of vulnerabilities on it, but I also have a person whose perception of their job and the quality of their work is not in alignment with the reality of their job. And that in and of itself is a threat. And we'll talk more about that later. What we're really getting to is that we need a new way to do risk assessment. These approaches, these problems, they're not working. Risk assessment needs to be more useful. It needs to be more tangible. It needs to be something that executive leadership can actually use. We accept that the volatility of these environments makes this a fundamentally qualitative effort. Because it's qualitative, we know we're going to need assessors who actually understand IT systems. So how do we do this? How do we make risk assessment more accurate, more responsive, more actionable, quicker? And that gets us to rapid risk assessment. Rapid risk assessment is a new approach to risk assessment. Its whole purpose is to accelerate the entire process. And what we've done is we've taken the NIST 800-330 series and we've said, what do we want to keep and what needs to go? And how can we just speed the whole process up so that we can get data quicker? There's a couple of sort of key features to this. Number one, we're going to do integrated technical testing. All risk assessment must have technical testing as an integrated part of it. That means pen testing, configuration analysis, vulnerability scanning, this kind of technical data. We're going to trade a little bit of precision and accuracy for efficiency and usability. We're not going to let perfection become the enemy of good. We're going to produce good risk assessments, not perfect ones. We're going to focus on simplicity and clarity, making things very, very clear to leadership. We are not going to ever cite any kind of risk assessment theory or methodology because nobody cares. Nobody's going to read it. The only people who care about risk assessment methodologies and terminology are risk assessors, and quite frankly, most of them don't even care about it. So anytime you're writing down, this sort of ponderous sort of, well, we will describe the conceptualization of risk analysis, threat action, probability factorization. Anytime you're writing anything like that that sounds like big talking, important sounding nonsense words, I can guarantee you there isn't a single executive in the universe who is going to read that and care. They just flat out don't care. They're not going to read it. And so why even write it? A couple of other key things we're going to do. We're going to simplify things like value and probability. We're going to use something called a lens. And I'm going to talk about this and what the lens is to contextualize threat. Got a whole slide about that. We're going to talk more about that in just a little bit. We're going to establish authority to make risk judgments, and more importantly, this process has been fully and completely vetted for PCI, HIPAA, FFIEC, and NERC compliance. We, as ANITIAN, have been doing these for a little over a year now, and this risk assessment process, when done correctly and following the right method, the approach, is completely and fully vetted for all the various regulatory requirements out there. So how are we going to get prepped for this? So this gets us into our next section. Now we're going to get into the meat of what rapid risk assessment is. And the first thing is there's a couple of prep steps to get you ready as an organization for conducting this. And my hope in really this next section to kind of outline my intent is that ideally what I want to do is give you guys some really good ideas as how you can use these tactics in your own risk assessment efforts. Now keep in mind, risk assessment is a big complex topic, and we've only got about 30 minutes here, so I'm going to have to move pretty quickly, and I'm going to have to kind of touch upon a lot of things. But the hope is that you're going to pick up some good information out of this. It's going to help you do the risk assessments that you're currently doing or looking at doing, do them faster and do them better. Well, step number one, you got to get your entire organization to agree to 6 words. We call them the core 6, and no more than 6, because you get beyond 6, people's eyes roll back in their head and they lose, they lose interest in what you're talking about. Risk is a very misunderstood and way overused word. Frankly, we even make the mistake ourselves. We often misuse risk. Risk is often conflated with threat, vulnerability, and a lot of other words. You've got to get these words pure. You've got to get everybody on the same page as to what's a threat, what's a vulnerability, and then what is ultimately risk. Because if you can get these core 6 words, if you can get everybody agreeing to just these 6 words, you're going to have conquered probably the #1 problem that your risk assessment efforts confront, which is the language barrier. So, and it's simple. You don't need to use complicated definitions. Threat is just simply something bad that can happen. Anything bad. It could be something falls over on a building. It can be a tornado. It can be malware. It can be, an APT attack. It can be hardware fit. Anything bad that can happen to your environment is a threat. And I would say don't get into the whole threat actor, threat scenario. Just don't do that. Threat. Focus on the big word of threat. Something bad that can happen. Vulnerability is simply a weakness. It's a weakness in your organization that a threat could ultimately exploit. It's an unpatched server. It's a lack of disaster recovery planning. It is some sort of vulnerability that would allow your organization to fail. It's having a bunch of old computer systems that could fail is a vulnerability. The next 3 are going to modify what a threat and a vulnerability are. Impact is how bad the threat could be if it came true. Probability is how likely it is, but how likely it is in a given time frame. You can't just go, oh, well, this could happen. Well, yes, anything could happen. It's how likely is that in the next 12 months or maybe the next 3 months. A control is something that mitigates the threat. Intrusion prevention systems, a good disaster recovery plan, a good incident response plan. These are controls that help mitigate and manage those threats. And then ultimately risk is the assessment of the threat based on probability, impact, and relation to the relevant controls. Risk always has to be a qualitative assessment. You don't have a risk, you have high risk. You have low risk. There's a threat has a risk rating to it. And it's difficult, but you got to kind of force yourself into using these words correctly. When you're talking with executive leadership about malware threats, for example, you say, we have a threat of malware in our organization, and the risk is quite high. And they'll say, well, tell me all the risks in the environment. Well, the risks in the environment is the measurement. We have a high risk. Here are the vulnerabilities that are creating that high risk. And if we can eliminate these vulnerabilities, then we can reduce that risk. You get executives using that language correctly, a number of things are going to happen. Number one, first off, you're going to get people thinking about risk correctly. Number two, you're going to get them looking at it correctly. But more importantly, I got news for you. This is actually how executives think about threat and risk. There's a great story that one of our consultants likes to tell, and I love telling it. It's Steve Swan, one of our senior risk assessment consultants, tells this great story. It's when he was on Wall Street many, many years ago. One of his jobs was he was the security officer on a big new project that this big Wall Street company was doing, and it was huge projects, millions and millions of dollars. I mean, hundreds of people involved in it. He worked at a very, very large Wall Street company. Anyways, they were getting ready to release this big project. And, they were like a couple of weeks away from release. And Steve was like, look, guys, we cannot do this. There's some serious security threats to this, vulnerabilities in this product that we're going to release. And so, everybody's getting mad at him and screaming at him and like, you can't stop this project. You can't stand in our way. There's millions of dollars at stake here. And he's like, look, this is a huge threat to our business. And so the senior VP, Mr. Big Wall Street, guy who probably has more money than brains, right? They get on a big conference call and they're all the other project participants are, complaining, Steve's standing in our way. He's stopping all this. And so the VP guy goes, look, I don't care about all that stuff. He's like, what's the worst that can happen here? Just give it to me straight. There's a little bit of silence, and Steve says, a teenage hacker from Iowa can take all the financial information from every customer we have, put it on the web, and disclose it to everybody, humiliating us and causing massive financial loss to this company, and we all lose our jobs. And there was like silence on the line for a minute. He goes, fine, fix it, and he hangs up the phone. I tell that story, and by the way, they ended up fixing it. I tell this story because this is how executives think. They don't care about every infinitesimal tiny little vulnerability. They don't care that you just picked Palo Alto versus Checkpoint. They don't care about your ISO certified, brilliant, genius, regulatory, whatever big boy stuff that you bought. They don't care. You're not going to make them care. What they care about is, what's the threat to me? What's the threat to the business? This is the threat. It's high. Okay, let's do something about it. How do we do something about it? See those vulnerabilities? We got to fix them. Now I'm going to talk more about that concept, and that's why I bring it up in this slide, and why I bring it up. These 6 words are so important that you get them solidified and clarified in the minds of not only yourself, but in the organization as a whole. And it starts with you using these words correctly, which, trust me, is difficult. We even struggle with this sometimes. Which really gets to the next slide, which is you're going to simplify everything. You're not going to cite any risk management theories or terms. Nobody cares. Nobody's going to read it. It's not going to happen. So just stop citing all that. You're going to distill everything down into very simple business language, stuff that people just get implicitly. You're going to write at like a 5th grade level, not a high school or college level. You're going to express risk in your risk assessments as it is, in present tense, without conjecture, without indecisiveness. I can't tell you how many risk assessment reports I've read where it's written in this languid kind of academic passive voice, will be, should have been, on one hand, we can conjecturalize the theory of using ISO-certified network controls on the consensually side. There are these academic blather sessions of somebody trying to make themselves sound important. I'm sorry. Nobody is going to read your brilliant academic blather. Trust me, I've written that blather. Nobody reads it. Yes, it feels great to write it. You feel like you're some brilliant, author. I'm writing the greatest tome on the earth. Nobody reads it. Nobody. They don't care, right? You got to state risk as it is. We have a threat of malware. Here it is. It's not up for debate. We're not going to stand around going, well, I disagree with your conceptual. No, it's not a debate. It is. When you start talking and writing and communicating as they are, you can eliminate debate, and you get down to what the real problems are, which is why you got to always use active voice in everything you write. Now, I'm not here to give you a writing class, but I will tell you, if you want to avoid passive voice in your writing, very simple trick. Don't ever use the word by, B-Y. Just search every document you've ever written or every report or every anything or every email and just eliminate that word. Rewrite every sentence. That's my 30-second writing tip for all of you. Last thing is you should be able to sum up the entire risk assessment in literally like 5 bullet points. I got news for you. Most executives, if you give them more than 5 bullet points, eyes roll back, don't care, they're thinking about golf. They are not going to listen to a 97,000 list of data of, well, our Linux servers are currently using patch number 3.1.4.6.5, but if we upgrade it to the Linux distribution, nobody cares about that. No executive is going to listen to that. They don't care that you're using Linux blah versus Linux blah. They just don't care. They're not going to read it. Just sum it all up. Make it as clean and as simple as you can. Get right to the point. You're going to conduct technical testing. You got to do it. It's got to be done as part of the assessment. You've got to have penetration tests. You've got to have vulnerability scans, and you've got to have savvy IT people as part of the risk assessment team. This is critical because you need to corroborate what people are saying. You need to be able to sit down with people and say to them, okay, tell me about your job. Okay, blah, 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 I do this, the database guy like I mentioned earlier. And then you need to be able to take that technical testing and look at the two of them, and that should paint a picture. If you don't have good IT tech skills on your risk assessment team, go find somebody who has it. This is a great time to go buddy up with that network admin or that system admin who wants to get into security. If you don't feel comfortable with sort of the detailed work of IT security, then find somebody and get them on the team who does, because it is vital. You have to be able to vet what people are telling you, and that technical testing and the technical knowledge is critical to the process. Without it, risk assessment basically just falls apart. You're never going to have a real viable risk assessment without that kind of technical testing perspective. You're going to have to sell this process to leadership. You got to get them on board. Management has got to support what you're up to here. The truth is they will support it if they feel it's going to genuinely help drive the organization forward. So part of the process is getting them to sort of support the effort, to build credibility through the organization, to get people on board to accept interviews, and you need management behind you. And you've got to sell it to them. There's this sort of myth of executive buy-in, right? They're not going to buy into something. You have to sell it to them. So getting them on board to do this is really important. Okay, so I want to walk through the rapid risk assessment process at this point. And what I'm going to do in this section is really kind of walk you through each of the key steps of how do you complete a rapid risk assessment, okay? And I realize we're running a little behind at this point. So I'll try to move through this quickly, but I do want to talk about a few of them. The first thing you need to do is you need to understand what the scope of your assessment is. And the scope can be anything. It can be one server, 5 servers, your entire network, your whole global enterprise. It can be one app. It doesn't matter. You just got to know what you're going to assess. Okay, so before you do anything in any risk assessment, figure out what the scope, the assets that are in scope for your risk assessment. Basic principle, and you got to write it down. You got to get everybody on this. Okay, this is their scope of our assessment. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to lens that scope. This is what we call the lens process. Lensing is a critical and is the most important part of making rapid risk assessment work. It's actually very simple. It's nothing more than a categorization strategy. How are you going to take those assets and divide them up into some logical categories? Now, typically we use data type. Data type is probably the most common lens we use. So let's say we have a collection of servers. We can say, okay, on these servers are 5 different kinds of data, or 4 different kinds of data, right? There's confidential data, there's public data, there's internal data, whatever. You want to basically create those categories because that's how you're going to assign and analyze the threats. You're going to do it based on those categories because there are threats that probably apply to the confidential data that are way more important than apply to the public data. And so by lensing that, by giving yourself categorizations, you can now assess risk against those categories rather than individual systems. Now, your categories can be anything. They can also be systems. You could use we've used location before. It frankly is fairly arbitrary what you use to lens, but there's a couple of key things here. Lensing the data gives you what we call a contextual framework. It gives you something to now stand upon and allows you to move through the data quickly, particularly if you have a large scope. If you're talking about an environment with 20,000 hosts in it, that's going to be difficult to conduct a risk assessment against all 20,000 of them. You've got to basically chop them up into categories. Even if you're talking about only 5 systems, by categorizing everything, you now have a framework in which to work within. This will help you focus. There's actually a psychological principle at work here, which is if you can break things up and categorize them, it becomes easier to actually understand them, and it becomes easier to analyze them. This also greatly aids in comprehending the environment. It gives you a communication, a common communication framework to work from to describe the environment. So rather than saying, well, on server number 3,422, we have these, you can clump them all together and say, okay, all the servers in our Shanghai office are subject to these high serious risks and all or threats, and all these servers over here have these. You can clump things together, and now you have a way to manipulate your entire environment or the entire scope of the assessment en masse, rather than trying to deal with each individual little asset throughout the environment. Lensing has to be done right in the very beginning. You've got to decide how you want to cut things up before you start this risk assessment, because that's going to give you that kind of framework, that basis on which you're going to work. The next big step you're going to do is you're going to go out and interview people. You're not going to do surveys. You're not going to do questionnaires or questionnaires, whatever that is. That's a misspelling. You're going to conduct face-to-face discussions, because that is the only way you're ever going to get the truth out of people. You have to actually talk to people. Now, we've been doing interviews as consultants for a long time, and I can tell you that most people, and I mean this like 99% of people, are suckers for the truth. They want to tell you what's wrong. They want to vent to you. We sit down with IT people all the time, and I mean, it doesn't. All we got to do is ask a couple of very basic questions, something like, well, what's critical to you, or what do you, how bad are, how bad would these problems be, or where are the, walk me through your environment and tell me about what's going on. People will just open right up. Oh, well, this guy this is a problem. That doesn't work, and I don't know why we're doing this. People will vent to you. They like to vent. And within that venting is the threats to your environment, the vulnerabilities. They exist inside that conversation. And all you got to do is what we call chase the rabbit, which is keep following those threats, because they're going to tell you them. Keep following those vulnerabilities. When somebody starts muttering on, yeah, well, our databases are a mess, and we don't really patch them, and we haven't encrypted anything. Really? Okay. Tell me more about this. How did this happen? Well, so-and-so doesn't like this, and, blah, blah, blah is disagreeing. But you just keep that guy talking. You keep that IT person talking. They'll divulge everything you need to know, and all you got to do is write it down. All you got to do is say, oh, okay, they don't patch, this isn't happening, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Document it. Simply write down what people are saying. Now, there's three key people you want to talk to, and this can be anywhere throughout the environment. You want to talk to leadership, and your questions with leadership want to be about high level. How do you kill this company? That's kind of our exercise. Get leadership talking at real high level. Okay, everybody, let's theorize. If we were going to cause harm to our business, how would we do that? I guarantee you, every CIO or CEO or VP knows exactly the weaknesses of their business. Or if they don't, then you've just discovered a vulnerability in and of itself. They're profoundly tuned to some of those problems, and all you got to do is get them to describe them, and they will if you give them an environment to just vent about them. You got to talk to business process owners, the people who got to manage the various processes in the organization. Get them to talk about what's critical to them, how do processes work, what would cause harm, how do what system, if it went down, would really harm the business, or what data is really critical to the organizational success. You talk to IT people, the database administrators, system admins, network admins, firewall admins, etc. Most tech guys, it's not that complicated. Just get them to talk to them about their jobs. Most IT guys I know, they love to babble about, oh, well, look at this, I can do this, and I can do, isn't this cool? And they'll go on for hours and tell you everything you've ever wanted to know about how they manage networks and switches. And yeah, admittedly, probably only about 5% of that is interesting, but all you got to do is just sit there and nod and go, okay, yeah, wow, oh, dude, that sucks, dude. What are you going to do? Yeah, okay. Just keep chasing that rabbit. Chase the data. Chase it down. While you're talking to everybody, you're going to have an IT guy or a security guy go out and do some testing. And whether that's done internally or you hire consultants, doesn't matter. But you're going to go out and test the scope of this environment. You're going to do pen testing, vulnerability scanning, security testing. Basically what you want to do is you want to get that technical data and you want to get that interview data, and you're going to put those two together at the end. So you got to do this technical testing. Again, where the testing comes from is variable. You don't necessarily need to use outsiders, but outsiders can often be can cut through the environment quickly. The point of this is also to get this whole process grounded in real data, not feelings, theories, you got to kind of try to parse away people's perceptions of things rather than sort of the reality. So I see we got a bunch of questions coming in. These are good. I'm going to answer these in just a few minutes. So thanks, guys, for asking them. The next step is you're going to define the threats and you're going to correlate the data. You're going to sit back, and once you have all these interviews, you've conducted all these interviews with all the various people that are relevant to the scope of your assessment, and you're going to say to yourself, okay, what's something bad that can happen here? Look through your notes. It's probably written all over your notes. You've got it all over the place. This goes down. We get malware. So-and-so breaks something. This process fails. All you got to do is just categorize those threats. There's only about 5 of them. You got technical threats, operational threats, relational threats. That's personally my favorite. The relationship between, what's a threat to a relationship between a third party? For example, if your entire environment is dependent upon a third-party hosting provider, and that hosting provider doesn't much care about patching, you got a threat right there. You've got a threat. You got a relational threat to your organization. If that relationship breaks down, it could threaten the operation of your business. You have physical threats, tornadoes, facilities, bombs, whatever. Reputational threats. This is also a fun one. What about what threats to the reputation? Employees going rogue, people disclosing, dirty laundry, people getting on Facebook and frothing about how management doesn't care or something like that. These are genuine threats to the organization, and a lot of times people will tell you exactly what that is when you're talking to them. Keep them simple, and I'm going to give you some examples of threats here in my next slide. Avoid what we call compounding threats without a response, or as I like to say, avoid zombie scenarios. One of the problems with every zombie movie ever made is that the first zombie, right? There's always, the first zombie that appears. He gets the, the virus from the, the cave in Madagascar or something, right? The first zombie appears, and basically everyone goes, well, that's it. We're reverting to cannibalism. It's like society instantly collapses the minute a zombie shows up. That's not exactly how the world works. People don't just suddenly throw up their arms and go, well, that's it. We've got a serious virus here. Let's just all go home. Forget it. We're not going to do anything. That's not the way the world works. People respond to things. When there's a serious outbreak of a virus, the world doesn't just suddenly implode. We quarantine. Remember when there was that big SARS outbreak? What did China do? They went around and killed every goose within a 10,000 kilometer radius or something. Not terribly the most elegant solution, but it worked. It got rid of the virus. Too bad for the geese, right? So people respond to problems. So don't build these ludicrous scenarios of, a threat actor from, the Ukraine could influence somebody in, the UN to, implement the black helicopter concept where they take planes out of the skies and, come on, seriously. Get down to the reality of your environment, which is you're way more likely to suffer from, doofus spilling Mountain Dew down the side of a server than you are some ludicrous threat that's in, that they're blathering about at Black Hat. Don't get me wrong, Black Hat's a lot of fun, but a lot of those threats are kind of ludicrous. So here's some good examples, and you'll notice that they're simple. Theft, malware, denial of service, simple threats. Those are the ones. And I got news for you. There's probably only about 30 to 50 threats that truly impact your organization. And there's not much more than that. And they don't change that much. New ones will get added from time to time, but all things being equal, the number of threats that affect your organization is rather finite. And you'll see I've got a bunch of bad ones here. I would note that The first and the third ones are actually vulnerabilities. They're not threats. The second one was a threat that was actually elucidated to me when we were doing an assessment of an election system about 5 or 6 years ago. Somebody actually told me this is something we need to consider, and I'm like, no, we don't, because that is a cascading threat without response. It's interesting, but it's not realistic. The next step is to define your probability and impact scales. Again, simple. Use words. If you want to have numbers behind them to kind of help you define it, that's fine. But stick to words. Certain, high, medium, low, negligible. And that needs to be bounded. Probability must be bounded in a time frame, preferably not more than 12 months, 6 months, 3 months, whatever time frame kind of works for you. 12 months is sort of our default that we like to go to. What is the impact? Again, words. Keep it simple. If I'm an executive and you come to me and say we have a critical risk of malware attack and the impact to us would be critical, I get that. Those are words I understand. A catastrophic critical impact to our data is something I get. Whereas if you come to me and say, well, we have a 61.935 probability impact score scaling of malware, I'm going to go, what the heck does that mean? I don't know. You know, it's in the red sector. Okay, red sector. Are we going to get hacked or not? You know, I want an answer. I don't want a theorization. The next step is to build what we call the threat matrix. And frankly, you should have been doing this the whole time. And I'm going to show you what a threat matrix looks like on the next slide here. This is a spreadsheet that defines each of the threats to the organization, and it's simple. Threat name, threat type, affected assets, vulnerabilities, impact, impact type. You could read what's there. It's a simplified version of the threats that are relevant to the business, and that's what it looks like, right? So you see, it'll go across top, and this is actually a copy from risk assessment, a sanitized version from one of our risk assessments. You have a threat at the top. You can type the threat if you want, physical, operational, what have you. What is affected by that? What systems are relevant or in scope for that threat? What are the affected data types? Now remember, data type was our lens here. So we're categorizing using data type as our lens. That's our lens. So we had a bunch of data types defined for this. What are the vulnerabilities? Impact. If you want to type the impacts, you can. You type them by CIA, confidentiality, availability, and integrity. You don't have to type them, though. That's frankly optional. What controls are in place? What's the probability? Your final risk rating. If you want to type out the risk, that's fine. You can do that too. How are you going to mitigate that, which means how are you going to actually fix and reduce that specific threat? You're going to list specific things there. You'll notice those are very specific recommendations. And then ultimately what the residual risk is of that. That is your risk matrix. It is a highly simplified version. This is something that IT teams can work with moving forward. This is not intended for executive leadership. This is something for the risk assessment team to work on. What executive leadership is going to get is your business risk intelligence report, which is a distillation of that risk matrix down to the top 10 most serious threats in the environment. And it's even a distillation of the distillation. It's an extremely simplified way of defining the risk to the environment, and it looks like that. This is an example from that. You're going to have each of the key important threats in the environment outlined, what vulnerabilities are relevant, what is the recommended action to fix those, and then you just score out the impact, probability, and risk. Simple. I'm an executive. I see this slide, or I see this table. I get it. There's nothing confusing to me here. There's no difficulty, or this is language I can understand. We have outdated antivirus. We have 32 high-ranked vulnerabilities on in-scope systems. Notice I don't list every last vulnerability there. I just say there's a lot of them. Then you're going to do an action plan, which is you just simply summarize all the recommendations into specific actions. Here's one, for example, implement a SIM. That's a common recommendation we make for organizations. We like to estimate how long it's going to take and what the effort is. Again, this is a very specific thing the organization can do to reduce the threat. It's not some blathering sort of conceptualization thing. It's a specific task. Do this. This will reduce risk. Okay, last couple of slides, a couple of do's and do nots, and then I'll go ahead and hit the, I'll try to answer some of these questions that are out there. First off, a couple of do nots while you're doing risk assessment. Do not try to change the culture of the business. It's not going to happen. Okay, risk assessments, if your recommendation is, well, we need to get everybody in the organization suddenly thinking and, behaving in a completely different manner. Yeah, that's never going to happen, okay? I like to use educational environments as a good example of this problem. You are not going to change the environment of an educational environment like a university. They tend to have a very open sort of mentality toward access and information. You are not going to make that go away through a risk assessment. Any risk assessment that tells a university and tells a bunch of professors that they've got to, stop sharing information is going to be a non-starter from day one. Your environment probably has a culture as well. Maybe it has a very open culture. Maybe it has a very closed, tight culture. Maybe it has a very sick culture. Whatever that culture is, risk assessment cannot change it. It can slowly nudge it toward the right ways of doing things, but you're not going to fundamentally change your company through risk assessment. Don't ever cite any kind of risk management theory. Nobody cares. Nobody's going to read them. Don't use questionnaires. Don't use surveys. Don't use portals where you go and fill out stuff. There's a bunch of risk assessors that they hook you up with their here's your portal. Good luck with your risk assessment. Those portals are a gigantic waste of time, effort, and energy because nobody is going to input honest information. You've got to go out and actually talk to people. You got to interact with them. You got to get out there and meet with them. Don't document any kind of indecision. You're not sure about something? Pick one or the other. It shows weakness. People debate indecision. If you start going back and forth on things, that's going to give people room to go, well, we should do nothing then. And believe me, people will always find a reason why they shouldn't have to work harder. Don't create phony numbers, matrices, worksheets, process flows, a bunch of other ridiculous documentation nonsense that nobody's going to care about. Is your risk assessment designed to reduce risk, or have you win an award at the next ISACA chapter meeting? Think about that for a second. I don't say that to be kind of obnoxious. I say to remember what the purpose here is. The purpose is to reduce risk and protect the business. Okay, you want to write a risk assessment paper for the risk assessor community? Fine, that's something different though. And do not waste time with sensational threats. Medical device implant hacking is my personal favorite right now. Hacking cars is another good one. And lastly, my attack on all those VARs: don't ever involve anybody who sells you equipment in the risk assessment process, because I can guarantee you they will find a way that their product will somehow solve all your problems. That's not to say those products and technologies aren't important. Keep them at the end of the process. Keep your language simple. Keep it all simple. Vulnerabilities. Distill, distill, distill. Render things down to the basics. Keep things tangible. When you have recommendations, don't make them theories or good ideas. Make them tangible improvements the organization can make. And focus on what's likely, not what's merely interesting or probable. Okay? All right. Let me take a shot at some of these questions now. We've got a couple. So a bunch of people have asked, will the slides be available? They are available on our, that link right there, that bit.ly link is a link to our slide share. You're welcome to email me, and I'll be happy to send you a copy of the slides as well. So, yes, that will be made available. How would you apply the process in the content of internal audit? Would you use this approach on the risk assessment side only to define where audit, or do you see this as value in actually how to perform an actual audit? This is how to perform an actual audit. This is a process that internal auditors definitively can use. Now, I will admit to you that internal auditors are going to struggle with some components of this. Particularly, we find that internal auditors tend to struggle with the interview process because internal people have the difficulty of getting their interviewees comfortable. So that's a challenge that internal auditors will struggle with, but there are ways around that. We actually train when we do training for our customers, we train them on interview tactics and strategies as to how to ask questions and evaluate body language so that you can get interviewers to be more honest and more open with you. So yes, this is definitively intended for internal audit. But I will be clear, it is an IT risk assessment approach. It isn't necessarily going to apply to things like financial risk. Financial risk is a slightly different beast than this. This is more designed for like IT security risk and just general security risk throughout the environment. So let's see, next question. What is your perspective on risk known versus risk unknown? Do you believe most risks are already known and that through this process they are brought to the surface? Or do you see this process as bringing a lot of unknown risks to the surface? That's an excellent question. So let me respond to that. You go out and talk to the people in your environment, you are going to discover all sorts of things about your environment, things you probably weren't even aware of. Interviewing and talking to people is a critical component to making rapid risk assessment work. And yes, we operate on the assumption that organizations most of the time know exactly what the threats to their business are, or they're darn close to them. Now, the risk assessor can contribute to that process. Of course, as a risk assessor, we know that certain threats are more real than others, or more tangible than others, or there are emerging threats. For example, one of the big emerging threats is that we're seeing right now, and you guys all know about, is the fact that a lot of antivirus and anti-malware products simply don't work anymore. And that in and of itself has become a pretty serious threat to organizations. How do you respond to malware that your malware products can't detect? And in some cases, they are getting detected, but that isn't getting to executive leadership. So out of the process of interviewing people, those threats will start to emerge. That's the point of interviewing people, is that their rambling, their venting, their blather is where the vulnerability exists. There's this belief that if you can get a number of people talking about an environment or about a system, that the reality of that system will eventually emerge. This is exactly why police, when they go to investigate crimes, they don't just interview one person. They go and interview the neighbor. They go and interview the guy across the street. They talk to they call it canvassing, right, the environment. There's a reason they do that. They're trying to understand the lay of the land. They're trying to kind of piece together what happened at the scene of this crime. Risk assessment's not that much different. You got to kind of piece together what's really going on in this environment. And people know. Who better than to get that information than the people that are running the systems, who are responsible for these processes? Okay, next question. How do you get testing data from third-party service providers? You ask them. I know that sounds like a glib answer, but you ask them for it. And if they won't provide it, then you do it yourself. That's actually a challenge. If you're using like a hosting provider or something like that, they should be able to provide you with various certifications. For example, if you are PCI compliant and you are hosting your applications at a cloud provider, you need to make sure you know exactly what requirements that cloud provider covers. And if they don't cover any of the requirements, which, to be very honest, many of the cloud providers provide absolutely no coverage, then you have to take care of those. Risk assessment really isn't that much different in that case. You need to know what the provider is doing, and what you got to kind of understand the roles between them. And yes, you should come right out and ask them for their various reports and other things, and there should be technical testing behind that. And if they can't provide you that information, or they won't provide you that information, I'd start to seriously consider why you're hosting with that company or why you're using that third party. This is data that should be provided in some format. Now, they might not provide you a full vulnerability scan or every last little vulnerability in their environment, but they should be able to provide you something. Okay, next question. How do you come up with probabilities? Oh, great question, Greg. It seems to me that concocting probabilities is central to any risk assessment, but I have never seen anything that can identify probability of a threat. In most cases, InfoSec risk assessment seems to be black swans that can't be predicted. There's a saying that the greatest indicator of future performance is past performance. These things can be predicted. All you got to do is pay attention to the details. Yes, there are black swans. Of course they happen. But black swans are, you know, that doesn't mean you just go, oh, well, there's black swans. We're just not going to do risk assessment. You're kind of falling for those. That's the zombie, zombie thinking there. Oh, well, zombies might show up, so let's just revert to cannibalism. That's not a really sane response. How do you come up with probabilities? I'll be honest with you. It is an assessment. It is a guess. It is what is the likelihood? And a skilled assessor should be able to answer that. If you've had malware attacks in the last 12 months, what's the likelihood you're going to have a malware attack in the next 12 months? I'd say it's pretty likely. I don't think you need to think that one through too hard. Probability is something that you have to take sort of that, what do we feel here? What does the data suggest? What's the likelihood of you getting hacked from a third party? Well, how easy do you make it to be hacked? You have a bunch of vulnerabilities on your endpoint systems. Do you have an information security program that is basically a joke and people ignore? Do you yell at security assessors because you don't like their findings? Sorry, I'm a little sensitive to that one. You got to kind of look at the details here. What picture does it paint? Probability isn't easy to determine. It is something that takes time, and there isn't very good statistics about it. There's no two ways around it. A lot of the statistics are somewhat flawed. That's why you have to kind of take that assessment. It is an opinion. It is rendering an assessment. You're saying to yourself, what is the probability that this is going to happen in the next 12 months? Look in the past. Did it happen in the last 12 months? Yes or no? Is it likely to happen again? Can you predict some brand new malware 0 day? No. But there are 0 days. 0 days exist as a problem. So you have a threat that a 0 day is going to emerge and potentially hack your environment. So the threat is a 0 day. You have vulnerabilities to your environment, like you don't have proper maybe controls or log management or IDS IPS or something like that. There are ways to combat black swans. An incident response plan is probably one of the best ways to combat those black swans. How do you know you have a problem? Do you have ways to detect that? If you do know you have a problem, do you have a way to respond to that? Or does everybody just kind of throw up their arms and go, oh, well, time to go home. It's Friday. I don't care. So there are plenty of ways to combat black swans, and black swans are themselves a threat to your environment. And a good risk assessment takes the time to think about some of those black swans and think about ways to create controls and practices that can respond to those black swans in a reasonable manner. Okay, next question. Have you reviewed the new HSS HIPAA security risk assessment tool? Any thoughts? Yeah, it's okay. I don't have any real serious thoughts about it. A lot of the problem with the tools is, again, they follow some very traditional methodologies. The big problem with a lot of these tools, and I think this tool is particularly has a problem with this, is that it still relies on people punching data into that tool who may or may not know. The tool is only as good as the data you put into it, and you've got to go out and get that data. And you've got to get that data through interviews and technical testing. So using the tool is just a mechanism to facilitate. I don't particularly like some of the layout and some of the design and the way they do things. I think it's more complicated than it needs to be. But again, the process that we describe, rapid risk assessment, is not necessarily dependent upon one specific tool. You can use lots of different tools to achieve these ends. You can use spreadsheets, frankly. You don't need a tool to use it. That much being said, with everything, what we say is, if the tool helps get you off the ground and get you going, then by all means use it and take as best advantage of it as you can. It looks like that is our last question. Again, our slides will be made available. We do have a recording of this presentation. I apologize for running over a little bit. We went a little longer. As you can see, this is a pretty big topic, and there's a lot to talk about here. I do want to thank all of you for attending today and listening. If any of you have any additional questions or concerns, or you want to know more about rapid risk assessment, please feel free to email us. We love talking about this. Recording, somebody I just see asked this, Sean. We'll make the recording available. We'll try and send out a link, if not probably tomorrow or certainly by the end of the, well, tomorrow is the end of the week. So we'll send out a link to the recording, and again, we'll also have the slides available to you as well. I'll try and get this up on YouTube, if not this week, then next week as well, okay? Again, thank you everybody for coming today. I hope all of you have a great day and a great weekend, and I hope this has been educational and informational to you. And thank you again. It's been a pleasure. It's been a pleasure speaking with all of you. Take care.